So, welcome to episode 8 of Plays Well with Others. I am Andrew Moore, as always, and also, as always, I'm joined by my illustrious co host, Jess Agnew. So, if you've listened to entire episodes for the last, let's say 3 or 4 episodes, you'll remember that I never remember to plug the podcast at the start of the episode. So we're already starting off on an innovative foot here. I'm going to go ahead and ask you, whatever app you're listening to this podcast on, go ahead, give us a rate, give us a subscribe, share with your friends, your family, your dog. Help us get the podcast out there, because we're making some good content, and we're getting a lot of the right conversations out there. And I want to get more feedback here from more of y'all, and really get down to the nitty gritty of what it takes to make really effective digital organizations. So getting into this week's episode, or today's episode, if you listen to our last episode, episode 7, it came out today, day of recording. But if you haven't heard it, go back and listen to it, because there's a phrase that Jess here coined, and I think it's a great phrase. I've already gotten a lot of good feedback on it. But when talking about agile transformation, or really building effective teams from the get shtick done mentality, the GSD mentality, and moving into something more mature that's able to reach enterprise scale, you have a scenario that Jess called anecdotal success but statistical failure. And what we mean by that is you have these scenarios where we're not tracking anything, we're not writing anything down, we're not looking at the metrics or the KPIs, and everything feels good because we're still in business. We still have an office to come to, and everything's going honky-dory. But when you actually start looking at the numbers, the delivery metrics, and the capacity, and all of the value add statements that you have in more scalable organizations, you start realizing that, we were busy, but we were busy on the wrong things, or we were leaving money on the table, leaving capacity on the table, just simply because we weren't interested in scale at the time. Mm-hmm. And that's 100% legit. Everybody starts somewhere. And yeah. I kind of described it in 3 phases, because engineer brain, I wanted bullet points. But this phase 1 of GSD, again, you know what that means. This phase 1 of GSD, while it feels like it's moving fast, you're probably developing a lot of features. You're in that startup mode. Mm-hmm. You're going to have risks of not knowing what's coming next, not having that full vision and that full strategy. But moving into phase 2, and this is where we want to camp out today. Phase 2 is that point where you get to where maybe you've brought in a new strategic leader, somebody that has seen how to grow organizations out of that early startup into kind of mid-cap organization, or we're looking at like Series C, Series D, kind of we're at the point where we want to transition into something more sustainable that's able to grow more predictably. Mm-hmm. And we've both experienced this a lot, but
yes,
we've got some really tactical and pragmatic approaches that we want to dig into about how to minimize the risk of phase 2, but also to maximize its effectiveness, and ideally get you from phase 2 to phase 3, which was profit sooner and quicker. Mm-hmm. So, Jess, I know you've got a lot of things on your mind, and a lot of things that come up, because Jess, in her function as project and product management, is often at the core of making phase 2 successful, and potentially moving out of phase 1 and into phase 2.
Yeah, for sure. It's one of my favorite things to talk about, because there's light bulb moments that come for different people at different times as you kind of transition from this phase 1 to phase 2. And it's really fun to kind of be a part of that and see it happen and evolve. But to your point, let's talk about some tactical things. So, phase one is you are serving the customers as best as you can in kind of the chaos of just requiring to get stuff done. There's feast and famine times where you're waiting for work and then you have way too much work. There's not a lot of predictability in your future, but you have these anecdotal wins with these great leaders that you can point to say, hey, see, I'm successful because I've done this thing. What you don't have is any KPIs, metrics, proof of predictability within your processes or anything that you can deliver on a consistent basis to prove out the value that your organization is bringing. So that's where we want to drill into for phase two. You want to understand, first of all, how to define what your KPIs should be. And I would encourage each leader to define their own KPIs for their organization. Don't just look at what's in the books for project management offices or products, because each organization does need to interpret this and understand it for themselves. And we can do a whole other probably podcast series on defining that. So that's all I'll say on it for now. But the second thing that you need to do is start getting everyone on board with what's going to be changing. We talked a little bit last time tactically on how you do that with your team. I'd like to talk now about how you do that with your leadership, because that is really, really important, because leaders are going to be consuming your services in a different way than they have previously. They're not just going to call up their favorite developer and ask them to do this thing for them and then praise them after they get it done for them. That can't fly anymore. That can't be the way that you do it. And sometimes that means that your developer is going to be responsible for letting you know when this high level person calls and says, hey, I'm pulling, Jess and Andrew into this conversation, or I'm pulling so-and-so into this conversation so we can get it into the backlog. And empowering your team to be able to do that, hugely important, whole other thing. But let's talk about getting your leaders invested in this. And there is a little, a tool game that I like to play with leaders that I've done thousands of times, not really thousands of times, but, tens and tens of times. And it has been successful every single time. And I'm going to share it with you really fast. It's out there already on the web. I'm sure any product owner has probably played this game before. You have 4 people who pretend that they're a customer. You have 1 person who pretends that they're a developer. The person who's pretending they're a developer is sitting at a whiteboard with a marker. The 4 customers each have a word that they want that developer to spell for them. The first customer, is going to be able to only give 1 letter at a time for what their word is, and they have to spell the whole word. And you have 3 rounds. First round, all 4 customers are screaming their letters at the developer simultaneously, trying to be the loudest so that the developer will write their word down. Round 2, you're going to go round robin, and each person is going to give a letter. And the developer is going to calmly write down each letter that's given to them. And in round 3, you're going to start with customer number 1. They're going to say every letter, A-P-P-L-E, apple. And the developer is going to write it down. Then you're going to go to the next customer. They're going to give you every letter of their word. The developer is going to write it down. Every single time, and this has never failed in all of the times I've done it, round 1 is the most stressful and horrible experience. Round 2 is fine. You get maybe 1 word done. Customers tend to be fine, kind of happy. Round 3 is your most efficient round. Most of the time you get it all done. And if you don't get it all done, you get a heck of a lot more than you did in either of the previous 2 rounds combined. And also first round tends to be really bad. Like none of the words are right. None of the letters are in the right places. It's awful. All that to say, and I know that was long-winded, but all that to say, how you manage work will directly result in how successful you are from a statistical perspective. And it's really easy to have those single wins, but you want to transition in an organization that's going through a digital transformation. Your goal is to be successful consistently, not successful once in a while. And this is where work management, understanding how to efficiently utilize your resources, understanding how to prioritize, and getting your leaders bought into the idea of prioritization becomes just wildly important.
Yeah, and to espouse the theme of the podcast, Plays Well with Others, it's so important that you have product and engineering partnering together,
Yeah.
or whatever it is that whatever functions in your organization, to get away from the technology podcast aspect, whatever it is at your organization that's managing the book of work, what are we doing, and execution, actually doing it. Those two functions need to be joined at the hip, so to speak, to make this work really well, because what's going to happen is Jess is going to be making sure that the leadership, the stakeholders at large, understand how they will be receiving updates, how they will be receiving information, and how they will be able to provide input into execution, order of priority, the features, acceptance criteria, all of that. But then on the other side of the coin, in my world, around engineering or around execution, I have to make sure that in phase 2, like we talked about, the risk is you're going to burn people out because suddenly I'm out of this anecdotal success bit. So maybe in phase 1, as a John Smith developer, maybe in phase 1, my days are a little hectic because I don't know what to expect, and I come in and I wait for a phone call. But in general, I come in at 8 and I go home at 5, and I stop working when people stop yelling, and people stop yelling about the time they want to go home. So while there's some chaos there, it's generally, you build up this degree of predictability of the unpredictable. I know I'm just going to do stuff for 8 to 10 hours, and then I'm going to go home. But in phase 2, you pull the covers back and you start seeing how much stuff is out there to get done.
Yeah.
And you run a very strong risk of the typical employee, we'll say, we'll genericize this, the typical employee that wants to be helpful and wants to be successful, and successful for them has always been get shtick done. So what happens when they have this big backlog, this full list of all the stuff that needs to get done? Well, they're going to start stressing over that whole list.
Yeah.
And they're going to start working on the list, and they're going to start beating themselves up because they've got the whole list. They got to get the list done, right?
Here's a secret, though. The list will never get done. The list will continue to grow in proportion to the work that you do.
Well, bingo. And that's part, there's an education aspect of that. But where I wanted to focus was as the executive leader, the leader over the execution aspect. Yeah. It is super important for you as that function's leader to understand how to, one, to coach those folks through this transition so that they understand the list is never going to be 0. If the list is 0, we got nothing else to do. And it's like, we don't want the list to be 0. But also, it's important to understand what the demand is and what your role is to supply the execution against that demand. So to get into the weeds just a touch, whether you use, Azure DevOps or GitHub or Jira or whatever you're using as a work management platform, there are likely some reports that are canned that come right out of that are helpful and have been helpful for me. And they're ones that I set up basically day one. And I'm looking at, I think Azure DevOps calls it the cumulative flow diagram, and the Agile practitioners out there are going to call me on not knowing the names, but the cumulative flow diagram, it essentially shows what is the composition of our book of work. How much is out there that is done? How much is out there that's active? How much is out there that's not done? And what I'm looking for there is I want to see largely linear progression. I don't want to see any gross spikes in active work. I don't want to see any gross spikes in backlog or spikes in the other direction, so up or down. I want to generally see that we're consistently delivering. If there's a dramatic change somewhere that I can't account for, maybe just stayed up late one night and put in a bunch of tickets.
I never do that.
It's happened. It's happened. and that's fine. But usually my first call when I look at it is, holy moly, what
Mm-hmm.
happened? And Jess will say, oh, well, we made a whole bunch of stuff for this thing. Okay, fine, cool. I can explain that away. No harm, no foul, no problem. From there, I'm going to lead time and cycle time. So lead time being the amount of time it takes to get from ideation to completion, and cycle time being from start to finish. So work start to work completion. And those are semantically similar metrics, but what I'm looking for is that low standard deviation. I want to see that in general, when we start a user story, when we start a request, it takes roughly the same amount of time to finish it. And what that tells me is not that I've got faster developers and slower developers. It's not that we have, you know, issues with delivery. What that tells me is, are our requests decomposed enough?
Mm-hmm.
So is the partnership between product and engineering working well? And then it tells me, are there areas of risk in our environment? So when I pull the covers back on or open the hood on a particular app, does that take me disproportionately longer because of what it is, where it is, and what data is
Yeah.
involved? And so I'm looking at all of those things to see, how well is my process working, how well are our relationships, and how good is our overall architecture to allow us to work.
Yeah.
So it's I talked a long time, so I'm gonna concede the floor in a second. But to summarize, and I'm probably gonna need this sound bite, but to summarize, it is two sides of the same coin. So product and engineering. So engineering, largely I'm focused inward. I'm managing my team, I'm leading my team, and making sure my team is healthy, making sure that my technology is healthy. And then product is leading through this phase outwardly to make sure that our stakeholders, our business owners, our CEO and president are on board and understand why and how this change is going to take
Mm-hmm.
place. And if they're not, if both of those functions, executive and strategic or executive and planning, aren't in lockstep, then you're not going to form a good team, and one side's going to leave the
Yeah.
other, and it's going to be sloppy.
So let's spin off of that a little. Let's talk about the integration between the two sides, because we talked a little bit about getting your leaders on board from a stakeholder perspective. Andrew talked a little bit about how to be a good leader from a technical perspective, or from the team that's dealing with this work intake situation. So let's talk about the merging of those two, because change is hard, and we talked about that a lot in the last episode as well. How to get your team on board with change. But let's say we've got the change. We know what we're going to do. We know what our work intake methodology is going to be. Maybe you do Kanban. Maybe you're doing sprint cycles. Maybe you're just doing first in, first out, because that's what works for your particular company or your particular situation. Whatever the case may be, you have your work methodology. You don't want to flit around from methodology to methodology. You just need to find something and build some consistency around it, because true change comes from incremental improvements over time. You're never going to put the first best thing in place. The first thing's never going to be the first, or the best, I mean. You're going to throw out the first pancake eventually. But once you get something in place, it's consistency that's going to matter for at least 3 months while you build up some statistical data to figure out where you are. And 3 months is the minimum you can have something in place to get relevant statistical data that will allow you to make an assessment of how well you're doing. So you have to have two things. One, consistent work intake methodology. Work has to filter into your team in a consistent, predictable manner, which means calling your best buddy, teamsing your best buddy, pulling them into a Zoom call. While all of that is, has its time and place for escalations, things like that, you still have to filter the work into the system of record, whether that's Monday.com or Azure DevOps or Jira or any of the other types of work methodology tools that you have. There's tons of them. I could go on listing them forever. They all have their merits. They all have their detractors. It's not about the tool. It's about how you're utilizing the tool, getting it into the tool, and then consistent maintenance of that backlog over time. It's not a one and done. It takes everyday effort. of maintaining it, grooming it, keeping it clean, so that you have a clear image of what's in the backlog so that you can then assign out work based on prioritization from the different leaders. So it all has to come into one place and everybody has to work it in that place. And that's hard because people are used to helping their buddies out or doing this thing or doing that thing. And it does need to flow through the process. That doesn't mean that you can't have, like I said, incremental improvements to the process over time to better capture the different processes that your company needs to have, but you have to have a predictable process. And once that's established, you as a leader will be so grateful because you can kind of walk away and trust that something's there that's going to allow work to flow through and things won't get lost. Things won't get forgotten. You won't 2 weeks away from a deadline be realizing that you haven't done something.
Yeah. And I think Jess encapsulated that well. When the machine is working well, and by the machine, I mean the process, the pipeline, work intake, work execution, work output. When that all works well, then the folks involved, the people supporting the pipeline, whether they be developers building the thing, or they be product owners bringing the work in and formulating it, or they be, if it's not, we're not technical, we're talking about, a payment processing company, or let's bulk mailing. If you have work that's coming in and you have people that are doing the work, once that process becomes smooth and everybody's on the same page and everybody's working together, then one, you as the leader over that function don't have to pay attention quite so much day to day to the tactical. Like if you take a day off, you're not looking at your email. You're not looking at Teams to say, hey, I need you to do XYZ today. That micromanagement, not only does it become less possible, not only does it become less needed, it becomes less possible because it's a machine. It's a huge machine. And you stepping into one specific area and changing things is not going to be valuable. It's not going to work. So when you start getting this in place, you as a strategic leader can actually be strategic, and you can look at some of the metrics that I described and some of the things that Jess is talking about, and you can kind of start planning out for the next year. You're looking at objectives as a business. How do I be more successful rather than how do I release this feature?
And you need to have that proof of capability in the small tactical execution of day-to-day work before you're going to be allowed at the table to talk about larger term strategic goals. So if you don't have proof that your team can consistently perform, then there's nothing that's going to just open doors for you to be brought into, a senior leaders meeting to talk about what you can bring to the table. You have to do that grunt work first. You have to have that process in place to be able to prove out your capabilities. And then you need to start advocating for yourself to be brought into conversations of longer term strategic goals, because you have proof that you are part of the execution of, these visions that other people have. So now you need to be a part of the conversation and your vision needs to matter as well. And you can't do that until you have this step 2 completed. And that kind of brings you into phase 3 of being able to move into more of a strategic planning, road mapping, long-term execution model where you can look 2, 3, 5 years in the future and start having some longer-term plans for that.
Right. And that was when we were talking earlier on the last episode. Go back and listen to episode 7. When we were talking earlier and we were laying out these 3 phases of digital transformation or agile transformation, what I was writing down was pros and cons. So obviously in GSD mode, you're moving quickly, you're able to respond quickly, you're basically, you have 1 day of patience. So everything intraday you can pivot. But as you get down to phase 3, which I titled Profit, you get down to the ideal state. The benefits are, everything's good. I can see what's going on. I've got transparency. I'm a strategic leader. I'm looking out. I'm worried more about how to provide value to my business than I am getting through to
Yeah.
Friday. But the risk, I had to think about this one for a bit. So like, it sounds great, right? But the risk is largely on you as a strategic leader, and that's complacency. So everything's great. I don't have to babysit this process on a daily basis. I don't have to be engaged tactically as much. And I only really get down into the weeds when somebody calls me and says, you know, gripe, this thing's broken. I need you to fix it because you hate me. Okay, well, fine. I'll dig into that. But if you're complacent and you don't apply, if one, you lose touch with what's going on a daily basis, then you're not giving the team the care and
Yeah.
feeding, the TLC that they need. But you're also not looking out forward. You're not looking at the strategy and saying, well, I get that we can work on this for this year, and we can improve our manufacturing processes, we can add efficiency, we can do all these things. But what happens when AI comes up? That's in, maybe it's a year out, maybe it's 2 years out. There's going to be value, and no matter what industry you're in, artificial intelligence, AI, machine learning, data science, that's going to be everyone's bread and butter in 10 years. I mean, probably not even that long. So if I'm not paying attention, that's going to sneak up on me. And if everybody's going to do it and I don't, then I'm relegated to buying a solution off the shelf, and it's no longer disruptive to my industry. It's no longer innovative. It's a cost of doing business. It's table stakes. Whereas if I were paying attention and I had my hand on the tiller and I said, oh, crud, AI is coming. There's going to be a value statement here. And for my business, we're going to intentionally avoid talking about mortgage lending. But for my business, if it's healthcare, I want to be able to provide better patient outcomes. And I want to do it without staffing linearly or staffing one-to-one. If I do that today, then in 2 years, when everybody else is buying it off the shelf, I've already built it in-house. It's purpose built for my system, for my process, and I'm able to provide better customer service, better user experience. I'm able to pad my bottom line because I've taken all of this efficiency and added it into the stack between top and bottom.
Exactly.
That becomes a value statement. And all of this, I swear there's a point, all of this happens because you started adding in work management and you started adding in your ability to get out of the day-to-day. And in so doing, you've implemented artificial intelligence in your company and increased EBITDA 40%.
So I think what you just described there and what we've been talking about over these past two episodes is really the transition of being a boss to being a leader. Because when you're just a boss, you're pointing, you're micromanaging, you're telling somebody what to do on a day-to-day basis. What we've talked about here is how to transition being a boss into being a leader. And when I say leader, I mean you are the stewards of the resources within your care. You're not the person doing the work. You're leading and taking ownership of the people who are now doing that work. And so you become somebody who's helping direct the flow of your business and change the course of how you're accomplishing and what you're planning to accomplish. And it becomes bigger and more important, harder on a lot of levels because you're pushing yourself from a different thought process. But it does also become, I think, 3 billion times more meaningful because you aren't just participating in point, go, get this done, you do that. You're participating and you've got a whole team with you who are now moving strategically in a direction that you're helping to guide, but that everybody's got input into. And it's a really beautiful thing.
Well, folks, that's it. Jess has done it. That's the last episode of Plays Well with Others. Can't follow that. But seriously, I'm not going to follow that because we're at time, but also because that's it. We're shifting from manager to leader. We are doing that through making all of our teams well defined, well supported, and with visibility into how they're doing and how we can be more strategic, more innovative, more disruptive. So, can't say it any better. That's been episode 8, Plays Well with Others. I'm Andrew Moore. This is Jess Agnew, the well-spoken one of the two.
Um,
And I will remind you, because I remembered at the first of the episode, go ahead, like, subscribe, bell, whether you're on YouTube, Apple Podcast, Spotify, wherever you're listening. Go ahead, share it, give us a rating, give us whatever you can give us, whatever your particular flavor of app provides. Anything you can do to help get the word out there, share the show is much appreciated. I've appreciated all of your engagement, all of you that have reached out as text messages or LinkedIn, wherever. Really appreciate all y'all. And thanks for listening.